Welcome today to a new video in our CESI Insight series. Welcome Joost Korte, Directorate-General of the Directorate-General Employment and Social Affairs and Inclusion. Welcome, Mr. Korte.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation.
Mr. Korte, how do you experience the Corona crisis professionally and privately? And how, very interesting also, how did you DG adapt to the new situation? How will your DG go back to normal?
Yeah. Well, yes, I mean, I think we're all struggling a bit with this question and with the new rules. But I must say, of course, I mean, as a manager of this rather large DG, my first responsibility has to be the safety of the staff. So I'm following very scrupulously the rules that the Commission is making for this, which are really quite strict. And I must say I'm extremely proud, in fact, of the staff, because in spite of the fact that I think in total over 35,000 staff of the Commission are working from home, I have been working from home now for 3 months. It hasn't actually stopped the activity of the Commission at all. And I think this is really extremely impressive. People are working sometimes in very difficult situations, in particular those colleagues with young families and children. I can imagine how difficult that must be when the schools are also closed. And I think, but I'm actually, very happy because things do continue. It's not the same. I'm spending probably like you and many of the colleagues in your organization, my whole day in front of a screen. And it's not the same. You miss the human touch. You miss the contact. I miss the contact a lot. And I also think that as a manager, this situation obliges us to invest even more in sort of communicating with the staff. So I have various different ideas that we are deploying, various forms of communicating that we are using almost every day, also to stay in touch and to keep giving the people this feeling that they belong to something.
How do you think, I mean, we've heard a lot recently in the past weeks and months about the impact of the Corona crisis on labor markets, employment conditions, social protection. What is your, as Director General of the DG Employment Social Affairs, what is your personal, or how do you assess the situation? What do we have to count with or reckon with in the coming months and years?
Yeah. Well, I mean, here, very sadly, I mean, I'm not the bringer of good news. That you will understand. I think we're going to be in a very different situation, a deep crisis. You will maybe have seen the forecast that the Commission itself brought out a few weeks ago, which are really, really very bad. Severe contraction of the GDP of the member states, unemployment rates to be rising up to 9 or even 10%, from 6.5 in March. I think in a few months or years, we will look back on the 1st of March as probably one of the best periods ever in the history of the European Union, with all the indicators going in the right direction. Unemployment had never been so low. Poverty rates went down, still too much poverty, of course, but the numbers went down a lot. And here we are, 3 months later, and the situation has completely changed. Now, of course, much of those, if I may say so, the pain is not yet really visible, luckily, because member states have put, of course, in place a very impressive support packages. The Commission helped from day one by coming forward with a new state aid framework that gives member states a lot of freedom to put in place state aid regimes, and they have done it. Secondly, of course, the rules of the Growth and Stability Pact have been made very much more flexible by triggering this emergency clause. And from there on, we see that member states have been doing a very, very impressive work. We try to follow the packages that have been put in place, and they go up to 10–20% of GDP. And of course, this investment, which is extremely good, allows them to keep the short-time employment schemes in place so that people are not dismissed, and also various other measures to keep companies alive and keep companies afloat. But this cannot go on forever, of course. And we're now approaching, as we are exiting the confinement, and we're moving to the recovery stage, we can see that member states are really struggling how to keep people employed. And that is now going to be the big issue. In Belgium, we see now a number of first bankruptcies files being made. We see companies closing, and I think therefore we will inevitably see, and sadly see, unemployment rising a lot with all the social repercussions this will have. Of course, and in particular, the vulnerable people will of course suffer most: young people, women, people with a migrant background, people in unstable jobs. The other important point here to make, Mr. Hege, I think is also for your members to really understand that while the crisis or the virus hits us all pretty indiscriminately, it's a symmetric crisis. Nobody's to blame. The economic consequences of the crisis and the economic consequence of the confinement will not be the same everywhere. It's clear that workers in certain sectors are much more impacted than others. And more importantly, you will also see that certain member states and regions are impacted much more heavily than other regions. And this is unfair. And this is, I think, explains also why, after a while, it took a while, I think this idea of solidarity or help or being in this together became quite strong. Differences between member states are because their sectors, their economies are different. You have economies that are much more relying on services or tourism, hospitality industry, which are much more impacted than others, and for which it will be more difficult to recover. And secondly, of course, it goes without saying that the member states do not all have the same capacity to provide these state aids. I mean, if we look at the total package of aid and the 20% or the 10% of GDP that I mentioned that have been put into the economy, we see, of course, large differences. I think more or less half of this comes from one member state. I think we all know which one it is. There are other member states that simply cannot afford, to put such vast amounts of investments into their economy. And this, I think, is why a European response is so extremely important. And I also wanted to say that your paper of I think it was from your position paper, the 3rd of April, goes very much into this direction. And the Commission has picked this up, and we came, as you know, with some important proposals. First of all, to allow member states a much more easy use of the money that was still there in the structural funds, so the ESF, the European Social Fund, and also the European Regional Development Fund. There was still a lot of money lying around, not fresh money, but money that was still there, and member states hadn't yet spent it. And so we made it easier for them to make use of those funds. And I must say, by changing the rules very quickly, and this was done, and I think this helped also. We now know that member states are actually moving money from projects that went slow into fighting the crisis. I mean, employing nurses, employing doctors. Also, I think the short-time work schemes are being funded at a very impressive scale through the structural funds. Even before the new instrument is going to be totally operational, this SURE, which has been approved, but which is still not fully operational. Pending that period, member states are luckily using the funds that are there.
Yeah, no, altogether we don't have doubts either that all these funds will be absorbed, because there were questions around that in the past also, and we've been very, very positive also on the proposal of the Commission in both in terms of the first package and now the recovery package. So we thought it was quite positive and bold. So we just wanted to add that. Mr. Korte, what do you think? What will be now we're sitting here in front of our screens, but what will be the long-term impacts on our ways of work and the working conditions, maybe more generally?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think, and I hope, in fact, that lessons will be learned from this crisis for the way we are working. And also, a second important point I want to make is that, of course, the fundamental structural challenges that the European Union is facing haven't changed. They haven't gone away. So the whole climate transition, the digital transition, all these big trends and big challenges, they remain entirely valid. and they should not be forgotten. So I think the way that we are going to get out of this crisis will have to combine the two things. Maintain employment is the most important thing. Create new employment very fast. Invest in skills and education, and in particular technical education, while keeping, of course, a good eye on these fundamental changes. And if you can combine those things together, it can actually be a success. I mean, you always need to look for good news as well. I don't think it will be easy at all. I'm not going to tell you here a nice story. It will be very, very tough. But I think the way out is also pretty clear, and where the investments are needed. And I think I'm actually, as I said at the start, very impressed by what member states are doing. The Commission is helping, you know, but I never want to make too much of the role of the Commission. I mean, it's clear that the member states have so much more possibilities, and they are doing it. And this is also, I think, quite striking compared to the responses that were given, let's say, 10 years ago to the financial crisis, how different the approach now is. And that makes me very optimistic that we can actually find, maybe not a V curve, as they call it, go down and go up very fast, but a U curve. And but that will depend on how we respond together, and also how, I think, very much the social partners collectively work towards this process. I mean, if I look at maybe more concrete changes, I think definitely everything that has to do with organizing meetings. It's a more like at an operational level, organizing meetings. I think we've now all learned to do much more online. Yesterday, I attended the third video conference of the Council of the Social Affairs and Labour Ministers, which was still quite long, but it was 4 hours, whereas normally it's a whole day. And I must say, I admire the ministers because they are very disciplined. You can do these things. And I'm sure that meetings that the Commission organizes can also be done up to a certain level through online mechanisms, not all. I think also the flying and the traveling will therefore be, we will look at this a lot better. The way people go to the office in the morning. I mean, I have learned that you can actually also, if you want to avoid the traffic jams in buses, which you know are pretty bad, or if you don't want to be in a crowded metro, you can stay at home till 10:30 and work from home and organize your work in that way. And then you come quietly later, or not at all. I think this is, for me, I mean, my generation at least, is an eye-opener. How this is actually possible. And I think it is these sort of positive developments in an otherwise, of course, very, very gloomy situation that we also need to work on.
Mr. Korte, you spoke about togetherness, about solidarity. You mentioned the responses of the EU institutions. What would you say now, for if you would speak, for instance, to citizens who are not so convinced about the reactions of the responses of the EU and both the member states belonging to the European Union? What is for you now at this moment the clear advantage for a state to belong to the European Union in this time of crisis?
Yeah. Now, I think before answering directly that question, it is, I think, true that people were somewhat disappointed at the start of the crisis by the way the European Union as an institution and the member states collectively responded. I think I have no problem to acknowledge that, but I can also say why that is, because it is very important to, of course, underline that, strictly speaking, when you look at the treaties, the European Union has no competence in health issues. There is no power for the Commission. We are very strong when it comes to veterinary health for the animals, but not for humans. It's a bit of an irony, and that's why it was just not possible for us to step in immediately. Secondly, I also think that the European Union is not really a crisis organization either. When there's a crisis, and the treaties again are clear, it's the member states that do it. They can close borders if they have to, when it's proportionate and necessary for public health, and they did. I think it took in this overwhelming crisis a bit long for the member states to realize that closing the border has a price, and that it's actually impacting pretty heavily on their industry, and mostly, of course, on I think there are 1.5 million frontier workers. They cross the border every day. and go back home. And then if you have to go into quarantine for 2 weeks, just because you crossed the border, even though you're not ill and you've been tested, of course it doesn't work. So that was for me. Sometimes I use this anecdote that if you organize a party with your family, one of the first things you do, you inform your neighbors that it may be a bit loud. And if you're very smart, you invite them to the party, so then they won't complain. But this does not seem to be the rule in the European Union everywhere, even after 60 years of integration. I think many of these measures were taken on a purely national basis in a crisis. I understand. And then it was only later that they realized, oh gosh, but now we have a problem, but let's call the Commission to coordinate. And then we did coordinate, and then there was a lot of things were done, and very fast. The guidance that we gave for border crossings was followed very, very well. And I think it did improve the situation really fast. We also mentioned the mobilization of the funds, the guidance we gave for occupational health and safety, for the return to work. There's a lot of things were done after, let's say, 3-4 weeks. And now, of course, we're in the recovery phase. And I think that's where the real answer to your question is there. That, I think there is a broad recognition everywhere that the only way out of this is when we are together. It has to be a recovery plan that takes everybody along, because we depend so much on each other. Okay, you will have strong economies that will do better than others. This is not new, but even the strong economies trade a lot with the weaker economies. I'm from the Netherlands. I think the trade between the Netherlands and Italy is bigger, much bigger than the trade between the Netherlands and China. So if Italy doesn't recover, this has an impact. And I think this recognition is now very strong. And secondly, I think also, maybe even more importantly, in the long run, the strategic issues that are at stake now, which are about safety of your people, the health and safety of your people, the fact that you do not have enough masks, the fact that you do not have enough doctors, the fact that you do not have an integrated emergency system across the borders. It came. I know there were a lot of beds in Germany that were made available for sick people from France who came from the Vogue and the Alsace. Between the Netherlands and Germany, there was a lot of, but it came about sort of spontaneously because of the goodwill of the people. And in these strategic issues, should it ever happen again, or should another crisis, are going to be only possible to solve together. And you can see that spirit very strongly in the package that Ursula von der Leyen presented on the 27th of May, this Next Generation EU, where now, for instance, to give you just one example, there is a proposal for a health fund of almost 10 billion euros. So we moved to public health being almost negligible, to a proposal for 10 billion to do exactly that, to invest in the strategic preparedness of the European Union should there be another crisis. You can have a joint laboratory, you can have doctors that are mobile. These are not miracles, but they need to be organized. And I think, and also the dependence on China, the strategic independence, autonomy of the European Union is absolutely vital. And I think that recognition is very strong.
Mr. Korte, we are slowly coming to the end. Just what do you think about the current role of trade unions, and maybe even during Corona and after Corona? Are trade unions needed? What do you think? Of course, we know that we are needed, but it's nice also to have the assessment of other institutions. As I said earlier in the pre-discussion, that we have the feeling we're extremely, the membership in our organization is extremely valued by the national member organizations. And obviously, as they tell us, they are very important now, especially those working, representing the workforce in the health sector for their members. How do you see the roles of trade unions now and beyond Corona?
No, here you don't have to convince me of the importance of the social partners and the trade unions in particular. I think this is very clear. If ever, it is important now. And you can really see, maybe also making a parallel with the previous crisis, we could really see that the countries that came out best from the previous crisis, the financial crisis, were the ones who had a strong social dialogue, a well-organized trade union and employers cooperation together with the governments. And I think now even more. I mean, look at these short-time work schemes. They are largely also managed and paid for by staff and by business. This is very much a tripartite approach in many member states. And I think also the way forward into the new normal, as some people call it, will only be possible in close cooperation with the social partners. Look at the safety, health and safety at work. It's all done on a tripartite basis, and you will see this recognition very strongly in the papers that the Commission brings out. We also, this year, maybe that's also relevant for your members, in spite of the very, very special circumstances, the European semester, country-specific recommendations that the Commission always presents, were also very strong on social dialogue. Because some member states, unfortunately, in our view, used the crisis to reduce the relevance of the social partners. And I think the Commission took a very strong position against this. And we've been followed by the Council. So these recommendations, they stand. And I think you can really count on us, on Nicola Schmid and Valdis Dombrovskis, and indeed the President herself, to continue following that line.
Thank you very much, Mr. Korte. Final message to the CESI community?
Well, yes, I mean, of course, as you said yourself, you are really your members are in the front line. You really have the work in public administration, education, training, research, healthcare. So in fact, you are, in a way, your members are carrying the crisis on their shoulder. I just want to really say that and applaud, of course, the enormous investments that are being done there, sometimes at the peril of the members themselves. So I think, and secondly, we are, as you know, working on the action plan for the pillar of social rights, which will come next year. All this has been confirmed by the Commission, so we're not abandoning that idea at all. On the contrary, this has now become more important in the crisis that will come than before. And I call upon you and your members to be very active participant in that process. Your valuable input for the minimum wage, of course, was also duly noted. The minimum wage proposal, which is also continuing. Last week, the Commission started the second round of the consultations for the minimum wage, and we very much hope to be able to put forward a legal proposal, legislative proposal in November. The youth guarantee will also come very soon in June, and we are rolling out a lot of programs. And for all of these initiatives, I think the input of CESI is really highly valued. And then, of course, this year you have your birthday. It's maybe still a bit too early to congratulate you because it's only in December. But of course, I'm very happy that we work so well together, and I look very much forward to continue doing.
We too, Mr. Director General Korte, thank you very much for your time, for being with us, and all the best to you and to your team.
Likewise, and thank you very much. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.